We're joined by political analyst Sanusha Naidu, who joins us for this conversation. Sanusha, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Can I kick off this conversation with a simple question? Why is it that government is failing to defend its decisions if the intentions were good?
Good morning, Collier, and good morning to the viewers. It's lovely to be on the show. It's bizarre, if I can be as bold and honest in the way that I've seen this. I mean, when you are in a situation where your reputational risk is really running the risk of being a complete nightmare and a PR disaster, then it's kind of unfathomable that you would continuously use the same kind of tactic or branding or imaging to try and hopefully, address and pull back some of the tipping point about your brand, your reputation, the trust, etc. But it seems to be the more and more that the government gets steeped and merged in these kinds of controversies, they don't know how to actually pull themselves back from the tipping point. They don't know how to pull themselves back from the challenges. And it seems as if they just make the situation even more untenable and precarious for themselves, and they deepen the level of mistrust. So I don't know whether they're learning from mistakes. I don't know who's advising them on how to deal with the reputational risk. But from what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, and of course in the last couple of days around Eskom, and this kind of bizarre way in which you try to, on the one hand, deal with the exemptions under the PFMA, but at the same time, you then say, well, the state of disaster, we've done what we have to do, now we're actually revoking it, or we're repealing it, or we're doing whatever we need to do. Is it really that? Is it after the Minister of Electricity went around on a nice tour across the country, came back and said, it's not corruption, it's criminality and whatever?
Sanusha, I've got to ask you this question, because you use a very pertinent word there, mistrust. And I'm asking you the question as to how deep does that go for the ordinary man on the street if government's own alliance partner, this is what they call the governing alliance, the ANC, COSATU, and the SACP. Listen to what COSATU said about specifically the exemption of Eskom from accounting on wasteful expenditure by Treasury. And they said this was a license to continue looting at Eskom because it was tantamount to facilitating another round of state capture. If an alliance partner is able to say that, who am I to not agree with them?
I think you've captured it really well. You've characterized the fact that the mistrust is not just a mistrust in terms of a broad definition or just the way the word is used in context. I think it is actually an indictment, if that's a better way to put it, of how people feel, ordinary people like you and I, and ordinary people in spaces where they may not have all the information on hand, but from their lived experiences, they just don't trust government, they just don't trust processes, they just don't trust institutions anymore. And I think that level of mistrust, when it comes from your alliance partners that say to you, especially one that made such a damning statement about what the state of disaster was around the electricity crisis, then it actually tells you that this mistrust is not just deepening and it's not just becoming a manifested, pervasive set of levels of reputation and levels of apathy. It's actually people that say, well, we've lost complete confidence in the alliance, but in the terms of the body politic of the state, ordinary South Africans have lost complete confidence within the structures of governance and the structure of government. So even when they come out and they say to you, when you listen to the different radio stations and the talk shows, and of course on your show and other news agencies, as well as on social media, you get the sense that people have now come to the point where the mistrust has become a complete check out from what is happening. And people just say, well, you know what? This is all done to basically utilize the space and repackage the space for you to steal.
Well, I'm going to have a closing question around this element of mistrust, particularly as it regards corruption. But let me touch on this for a moment. So Transnet, we know the corruption that went on there, and we were educated at length about how it was done at that state institution. Guess what? They received a similar exemption last year, and that was admitted to by the Treasury officials yesterday. So, here's the question. Should we have another outcry over that, or is it basically spilled milk at this stage?
I think there is an outcry already about the way in which this tinkering and this kind of shifting the goalposts and doing these exemptions on state-owned entities, which have become a serious blight on the reputation and credibility of South Africa's governance. And it's wonderful if you have all of these institutions, but if these institutions cannot do their work, and if you're constantly interfering with that through these exemptions, then what's the value of having these financial instruments, etc.? Let's not also forget, Polly, that one of the things that has happened to South Africa is the grey listing, because we don't have proper controls in terms of legislation around money laundering legislation, in terms of jurisdiction, in terms of what has happened in the context of addressing these very criteria that we need to use. So I think the question then becomes, if you have reached this point where you want to basically tinker with this, and not just tinker, it's really just interfering with what's going on in the financial instruments and the governance. And then, of course, you then think that that's going to actually address the situation in terms of reversing what has happened in terms of state capture within these entities, then of course you're deluding yourself. You're living in a land where I don't think you even know what's going on in your own country. And I think that's the problem here. The PR issue is that we're trying to make it seem as if we're not really giving an exemption, but we're saying that certain things will not be reported on in the annual report. Come on, these are things that is going to basically cause even more disconcert and even more anger amongst the ordinary South Africans, and you're not going to save Eskom from getting a bad credit rating from the credit rating agencies.
I'm edging closer to that all-important last question I want to come to you with, but here's a political question before we get to that. Is it possible that the Minister of Finance could have done this, could have approved this so-called exemption without the President's approval?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Without
the President's approval.
I don't think this happens without the President not knowing. I mean, it's just the way it's supposed to be done. I mean, let's go back to the question of the President's consequence management approach. Let's take a business approach and let's try and have people doing performance appraisals, etc. I mean, if this is what the Minister has done and he's acted without the President's knowledge, I mean, that in itself means that his performance has to be put on the spotlight, because you can't make these unilateral decisions without having particular consultations on a situation like this, which is of national importance, and it's basically our national security interest. And it's basically causing an incredible amount of pain, suffering, and crisis to the economy in terms of where it is. It's not getting us investment. We can't. Production is stalled. People's lives and livelihoods are in a state of crisis. So if you make this decision on the basis of that and you didn't consult the President, then I think that there's something even more seriously wrong with our body politic and the state.
Well, here's that final question then, Senusha. So if you and I assume, and we're completely making an assumption here, that the President may have been or was aware of what was about to happen, what about the promise of clean governance under a new dawn?
If I can be very facetious and say, I'm not sure we even have that context and concept is even any more in the lexicon of the Ramaphosa presidency, because I think it's completely left the building. It's no longer in the orbit of South Africa, and it's no longer anywhere near what the rhetoric is. I think we've completely moved so far away from that kind of question of a new dawn and a clean government and a good governance and shining the light in dark spaces on corruption and holding people accountable. I think everybody has checked out on that. So I think at the end of the day, my view is that we are no more closer to that nirvana than we were when it was first announced.
Senator Naidu, we'll leave the conversation there. Thank you very much. Both of us this morning, I think it's fair to say we're quite cynical, and rightly so. If government is going to constantly back out of its decisions without even making an attempt to defend this. Thank you. Political analyst there, Senator Naidu.